So many languages, so many employees. How does it all work? By Dr. Leilarna Kingsley. Have you ever wondered how you manage languages in a multilingual setting? How do a group of colleagues from a range of countries and language groups communicate when there are many languages to choose from? Which language do you choose? How important is the English language? What kind of language policies can be implemented in such ethno-linguistically diverse contexts, and how do they work in practice? This short presentation sets out to answer some of these questions based on doctoral research in multilingual banks in Luxembourg. Luxembourg, with its multicultural and multilingual character and its international banking industry, is an ideal place to start. To set the stage, let's begin with the context of Luxembourg and international banking. Luxembourg, a founding member of the European Union, is one of the most multilingual countries of the EU. Situated between Germany, France and Belgium, it has two officially recognised judicial and administrative languages, French and German, a national language, Luxembourgish, and a complex multilingual education system. Luxembourg has also the highest proportion of resident foreigners in the EU, 43%. Furthermore, 42% of the total workforce in Luxembourg commute from surrounding countries, France, Belgium and Germany, as cross-border workers, which are called frontaliers. So not only are 43% of residents in Luxembourg foreign, 42% of the total workforce are also foreign. International banking is one, if not the most important industry in Luxembourg. In 2014, a large number of banks, 150, are situated in Luxembourg, of which a high percentage, 95%, are international banks or foreign-owned. These banks employ multicultural and multilingual workforces, consisting of multilingual Luxembourgers, cross-border commuters, a variety of EU citizens, and internationals. This multilingual labour pool is considered an essential factor in maintaining banking success in Luxembourg. In 2013, a staggering 76% of the workforce in the financial sector are foreigners, with Luxembourgers only representing around 24%. Cross-border workers represent half of that 76%, with the other half being resident foreigners. Banks also service international clients and are subsidiaries or branches of global banking groups or multinational corporations. So, what a complex environment to work in. If you were an employee at one of these banks, how would it all work? Let's take a look at the PhD research based on Phase 1 interviews with directors and managers in 10 banks, 3 Luxembourgish, 3 German and 4 international, and Phase 2 questionnaires and focus groups in 3 international banks. This presentation concentrates on the findings for international banks from both phases. In these banks, directors, managers and employees were asked about their language policies and language use in written and spoken communication, reports, emails, presentations, meetings, phone calls and informal talk. The international banks in this study employed between 200 and 1,000 employees and between 18 and 24 nationalities. To begin looking at the findings about the complex language use in banks, it is important to understand that each individual employee used languages differently. For example, if we think about one Spanish-Belgian employee employed in a client-related department in a Swedish-German bank, she used a range of languages on a daily basis. For written reports and meetings, she used English. For emails, she used English, French and Spanish. For presentations, phone calls and informal talk, she used English, French, German and Spanish. But what about how languages were being used overall by employees in the international banks? Importantly, the results indicate that despite Luxembourg being a country with strong multilingual traditions, and where French is increasingly being used as a common language or lingua franca between Luxembourgers, immigrants and cross-border workers, English emerged as the most widely and frequently used language overall in these international and multilingual banks. English played a vital role as the most important lingua franca across a wide group of nationals, as no other single language could be used to connect all employees. It played an essential role for connecting ethno-linguistically diverse employees from both the perspective of management and employees. English was used by first, second, third and fourth language speakers in interactions and alongside a range of other languages. In second position was French, which was used considerably less frequently than English, but it surfaced as an important language for socialization and for maintaining good relations with colleagues. This was more likely to happen when French, Belgian and Luxembourgish employees and other interlocutors from different countries with French language skills interacted. Other languages associated with the context of Luxembourg were also reported, such as German and Luxembourgish. A number of additional languages were primarily associated with groups of employees in these workforces: Danish, Dutch, Finnish, Greek, Norwegian and Romanian. Employees also reported accommodating to the preferred language of the client in spoken communication, and English, French, German, Luxembourgish, Italian, Swedish, Spanish and Dutch were reported. Having looked at the broad frequency patterns of language use, let's talk about particular types of communication. For example, were particular languages used more in spoken or written communication? Well, yes, a number of broad trends emerge from employees' practices. For written reports, English, as the most common language of employees, was by far the most frequently used language. Other languages were used considerably less frequently. In email communication, English played a dominant role, although other languages were also reported. In presentations, English was important alongside other languages. Presentations were reported as multilingual activities, with employees often presenting in a different language to the language of the slides. For meetings, a shared language was negotiated at the beginning, and they were frequently conducted in English, as well as a number of other languages. During social talk, small talk, interaction over coffee, in the hallway, or at the canteen, employees reported using a wide range of languages. So now we know the broad patterns of language use in these complex multilingual banks. But if you were a new employee on your first day, how would you know which language to use in daily interactions with a range of multilingual nationals? How does it all work? How do employees make choices about language use? This is what this research set out to understand, and this is what bank employees were asked. The results indicate that multilingual employees often had a number of languages to choose from, and so were constantly making language choices about which language to use in which context. A number of key factors contributed to the languages used in any given situation. The most important factors were the speaker and listener's nationality or ethnicity, and language skills, or known as linguistic repertoire. This was primarily due to the ethno-linguistic diversity of employees in international banks, where between 18 and 24 different nationalities were employed. The ethnicity of employees and their mother tongues were the linking factors that often drew employees into national speech communities. This connection was not solely based on language, but also on their national group identity. Employees commented on communities of speakers such as Luxembourgers, Germans and Swedes, as well as the larger French-speaking Francophone speech community, made up of employees from France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and other native speakers of French. Of course, employees who spoke these languages as second, third or fourth languages also participated in these speech communities. Language choice becomes even more complex when a wide range of nationalities with diverging language skills are employed. Employers reported the need to respond to the language skills of the person they were trying to communicate with. A Spanish employee explained it in this way. Well, if I would go to a French-speaking person, I would just adapt to French. I think you adapt to the person if you speak the language as well. You just adapt to the person you are requiring something from. Or if you go for coffee and you meet someone, you just adapt to the language that person speaks. If I didn't know the person at all, my first word would be English by default, and then by the accent the other person has on their English, you quickly adapt to the language. You can usually tell quite quickly the Swedish, German or French accent. Communication within departments differed considerably depending on whether employees were comprised of one nationality or a range of nationalities. Departments with one nationality shared a language, and this sharing of a common language could at times override the influence of the working language. For example, a department dealing with German-speaking clients employed German speakers. Thus, German was often used to communicate amongst themselves and with their clients. In contrast, if the language skills of groups of mixed nationals varied, communication within and across departments resulted in the widespread use of English, as noted by a Dutch employee. Well, internal meetings, if it's just with direct contacts within the unit, and if they're French-speaking, then it will be French. Or with Germans, it might be German. If it's a cross-unit or section, it depends on who speaks what. There may be French and German-speaking people, and the meeting will go in English. It really depends on the skills of the people. Clearly, in many cases, as those described, ethnicity and language skills were the most important factors in language choice decisions. However, when a range of languages were possible, due to the multilingual skills of the speakers or listeners, other factors had considerably more influence on language choice. These factors included the speaker's goal, whether it was 1, to get things done and meet the bank's goals, or 2, whether the goal was more to do with relationships and aimed at maintaining good relations at work. Of course, these two goals could have been happening at the same time, but usually one goal is slightly more important than the other. In addition, as I've touched on earlier, the type of communication being undertaken, for example, whether it be in a report, email, presentation, or meeting, also interacted with the speaker's goals and language skills and influenced language choice. Bank employees reported being strategic and choosing languages according to their goals. A Norwegian employee emphasised how important goals were to him. He said, "In the end, it depends on what is the goal of the meeting, or when you walk around, if you want to reach that goal. How do I most easily reach that goal? Is that by speaking another language? If so, then I do that. So you just try to adapt to the situation and what you want to achieve in the end." Other employees reported choosing languages based on other goals, such as arguing their case in a meeting and negotiating what they needed from colleagues. A Luxembourgish employee indicated how the goal of getting accurate information published in external sources influenced her language choice. She said, "If a German journalist calls up and you know that he doesn't want to speak English, you speak to him in German. At least you do know that if he has another question, say like in 2 days' time, he's going to call back. If he would know that you would only speak to him in English, he wouldn't call back and make up his own mind and print something which might be totally wrong. So I think people you talk to feel much more comfortable in talking once more again to you." Language choices were also made for relational goals. Employees reported choosing languages based on whether they wanted to maintain or enhance rapport, collegiality, and national identity with colleagues. Employees noted that the language a relationship began in often influenced subsequent language choice. Employees also reported frequently using their mother tongue as a way of maintaining and enhancing relationships with fellow nationals. These examples highlight some of the relational goals influencing employees' choice to use languages other than English. However, the relational goals of inclusion, involvement, and equality were also emphasised as the reasons for the widespread and frequent use of English within banks. This raises the question, so just how important was English in these multilingual banks? In international banks, English had special status as the most widely shared language and emerged as essential because no other single language could connect all employees. This use of English is particularly significant since employees were predominantly multilingual and nationals associated with non-native English-speaking countries. A Dutch, French and bilingual British employee explained the role of English in the following way. A Dutch employee said, "It's the international language, and with all the different nationalities, it's the easiest language. You could have taken Esperanto, but does that still exist? It's the most common factor." A French employee noted, "I believe as well that children in most countries learn English, and it does help afterwards when you want to enter into or start professional life." A bilingual British employee indicated, "Luxembourg doesn't just exist with Luxembourgers. Luxembourg's success is partly based on the fact that other people have come in with certain skills and there's a mix of people. You have to decide on a common language. You look at that." The relational goal of including all employees in communication was highlighted, above many other reasons for the use of English. Employees often switched to English, in meetings for example, so that all colleagues were included, involved as a matter of course. At one bank, employees indicated that polite linguistic behaviour within the bank embodied the use of a lingua franca, English, to include and involve colleagues in work-related interactions. This inclusion of others in language choice is vitally important, as noted by Bell. He said, "The use of a language which is unintelligible to any interlocutor defines that person out of the audience. It is the ultimate in dissociative behaviour, designating the uncomprehending hearer, an unratified eavesdropper, a non-member, even a non-person." In a similar way, a Spanish and a Swedish employee also emphasised the importance of inclusion of other bank employees by indicating that switching between languages other than English could potentially exclude colleagues. A Spanish employee commented that, "I think it's wonderful to switch between languages. I have a passion for languages. Most of the languages I speak on a daily basis in the bank, but I agree fully that the corporate language should be English." A Swedish-British employee added, "The only thing that one should be cautious of when switching is when it's excluding other people. I mean, they can't choose to join the conversation." Furthermore, English was also used to be fair and give equal access to colleagues and enable participation in workplace activities. An Icelandic Danish employee used English in emails so that her colleague was included and given equal access to the content-related material. She explained, "But I always write in English, due to my colleague who is sitting next to me, would not understand it in Swedish. If I would leave for vacation and she had to look into my emails, and then it would not be very fair for her to have to try and find out what I was writing in another language. So I always choose English." This multilingual Icelandic Danish employee also highlighted the role that English played as a middle language in interactions, noting that, "I think if you're able to speak that language, you talk that language. If not, you go back to English. English is the middle language. If you're insecure in another language, the language the other person is speaking, then you would choose English." Ironically, it is precisely because of the diversity of languages in these multilingual banks that English was essential as a lingua franca. Rather than diminishing its role, linguistic diversity has heightened the importance of English. This research highlights the special and unique role that English is playing in the 21st century, which has far-reaching implications. Given the international importance of English and its essential role as a common language in these banks, what kind of language policies can be implemented in such ethno-linguistically diverse contexts? The results indicate that in 2 out of 3 international banks, English, as the most common language, was the formal working language. In the 3rd bank, English was the primary unofficial working language. This common language or lingua franca approach is quite prototypical for multinational companies with many foreign subsidiaries. However, language policies related to recruitment and language courses were additional ways to manage language use. All 3 international banks, plus Luxembourgish and German banks to varying degrees, recruited employees with English language skills. All 3 banks also recruited employees with linguistic skills in other languages, which mirrored multilingual policies found in Luxembourgish and German banks. In terms of language courses, all 3 banks provided English language courses and 2 out of 3 banks provided courses in other languages. So those were the policies implemented, but how did these language policies work in practice? This research found that in practice it was impossible to restrict language use to one language at all times and in all situations in this complex multilingual environment. Consequently, a degree of flexibility in language policies was required in these banks due to the multilingual nature of communication in Luxembourg and the crucial role of English for including all employees. At these banks, flexibility was achieved through different levels of policy. Firstly, English was the official working language of the two international banks and denoted the overall strategy for the banks, that is, to enable all employees to communicate across language boundaries via a common language when required. However, management also achieved flexibility through the multilingual language policies of recruitment and language courses. To wrap up this presentation, let me conclude with some implications for language policymakers. This research indicates that if policies are to take account of the strategic and negotiated use of languages, a flexible approach to language management is considered useful at multilingual workplaces, where communication is complex, multifaceted and dynamic. Policies that ignore the vital role of English in these types of ethno-linguistically diverse contexts and the flexible ways in which employers use a range of languages may in fact end up sabotaging their attempts to manage language use meaningfully. Consequently, if banking groups or multinational companies want to strategically manage language use in their subsidiaries, they would be well advised to consider the local language practices and beliefs of both management and employees, as in the case of international banks in Luxembourg.